Welcome to episode 3 of the Argue With Me podcast. I am excited to say that I have David Friedman on this episode. David Friedman is a longtime influence of mine, especially when it comes to things like economics and the law, which is basically what he's best known for. I mean, he's just amazing on those topics. Historical legal systems that are very different from our own, the economics of private society and what a private provision of law and defense might look like. The Machinery of Freedom is a classic that I think that anyone interested in economics, law, or politics should check out. But because his views on all those things are so well known, I didn't want to sort of retread them. He's all over YouTube, and I mean, also there are the books that I just mentioned. He's all over the place on those views. You can find them easily. Of course, by all over the place, I don't mean that he changes his views all over the place. I just mean that they're so accessible. I wanted to talk to him more about his moral philosophy, which I could only find a few pages of writing out of all the years he's been active, explaining his moral philosophy. Unfortunately, I've seen him saddled with the label of consequentialist a couple of times. I've seen people say that he's a consequentialist, and he isn't. And I know he isn't, and he never says that he is one. I think what happens is that he makes such coherent, practical economic arguments that people think he's arguing from a point of consequentialism when maybe he's just arguing from a point of common sense. So I reached out to him and I wanted to know whether he'd be willing to discuss his views on moral philosophy. And I think you'll see that we had a rather robust discussion, aside from the parts where maybe I was failing to explain myself adequately to David, who is a brilliant man. I think that we disagree in some areas, but frankly, looking back on the conversation, I think that we actually probably agree on quite a lot and just slightly have different probabilistic ideas about what's true. I'm not as certain that intuitionism is the appropriate or is a true moral theory, whereas he is a little more certain of that. And anyway, you'll see in the conversation, I thought it was great, and I am very thankful that he gave his time to have the conversation with me. So enjoy.
All right. Welcome to the Argue With Me podcast. I'm your host, as usual, Jerry Bordeaux. I am delighted to have David Friedman joining me today. I'm sure viewers will know David from other work, including his book, Machinery of Freedom, which is a classic for anarcho-capitalism. Also, you have, what would you say, hundreds of YouTube appearances on various debates just in the past few years. And then even prior to that, I mean, I don't know how much work you've done in magazines and other videos. You've been at this a while.
Yes.
Yeah. So as we were just sort of discussing before I hit the record button, it's common to see David talking about anarcho-capitalism, talking about economics, talking about the law. I love these topics too. I appreciate your thoughts on those things, but they're sort of out there. They're readily available, I think, for anybody that wants them. It's just a short search away. What I don't know as much about, and I'm very curious to know, are your views on moral philosophy. And I want to just start this off with, I don't want to speak too much about myself, but I want to sort of let you know why I'm in particular wondering about it, which is that I speak to a lot of libertarians. They're my friends. I frequently receive pushback about some of my intuitions about morality. So, for example, I'm not sure that objective morality exists. I'm a big fan of physics, and I know you've done a PhD in physics, and I find my viewpoints and thoughts about physics frequently clash with some moral intuitions that other libertarians have. especially ones that come at things from a Christian tilt or a Randian tilt, or I know that would not be an anarcho-capitalist. And I think maybe you might be a kindred spirit in that. And I don't want to speak for you, but I'm wondering, do you think, because you've got this background in physics and physical science, do you think that affects the way you think about moral philosophy at all?
Very little.
Very little.
There are really two different questions here. One of them is, what are moral beliefs? Why do you believe them? And so forth. And the other is, what are your moral beliefs? And let me at least start with the first.
Mm-hmm.
And let me tell you a true story. And this is the story of one of the very few arguments I can remember that I unambiguously lost. I was an undergraduate at Harvard, and a philosopher named Isaiah Berlin was visiting. And I got into an argument with him. And the question was about the nature of morality. And my view at the time was that moral beliefs were tastes, that saying torturing people to death is bad is sort of like saying I like chocolate ice cream and don't like vanilla ice cream. And unlike statements about physical reality, which were facts, might be wrong, but were facts. And Berlin's response was to argue initially, not that the evidence for moral propositions was stronger than I thought, but that the evidence for physical propositions was weaker than I thought. That after all, there's no real way that I can prove that any physical facts are true at all. That it could be an illusion, I could be a brain in a vat, you can think of lots of ways. And then the question is, what is the evidence that we consider sufficient for concluding that physical facts are true? And the answer, I think, was that we tried the tests we've got available. Sorry, that's a phone, almost certainly a spam. Hello? We look for sort of consistent data from our senses. So I say, all right, I see a cup here. I feel a cup here. I don't smell it, but then I don't expect cups to smell. But if I tasted what was in that. So all of those things are consistent. It might still be a very fancy illusion, but that's the best I can do, and so I accept it. And Berlin's argument was that there are moral propositions that roughly pass the same test. And the example he gave was, imagine you encounter somebody who likes sticking pins in people. And you say to him, why do you like sticking pins in people? And he says, well, I really like the feel of a pin going into a resilient object. And I, being a clever person, say, right, here's a rubber ball. Why don't you stick a pin in that? He says, hey, that's great. It doesn't squeal or yell when I stick pins into it. All right, we would interpret that person as crazy. And we would interpret it as crazy that although people disagree a good deal about moral propositions, the idea that pain matters is pretty much on the same category as the idea that this cup is here. That is to say, all of our evidence, if our evidence now is what you might think of as moral perceptions, what does it seem to people is right or wrong? Just as my physical perceptions is, what do I see? Does it seem to people is sitting in my hand? Each of which could be wrong, but nonetheless, that kind of proposition passes that test. And so that got me to a position which is referred to by philosophers as intuitionism. And the position is that there really is, as it were, a moral universe, that there are moral facts, not facts that can be deduced from facts of existence the way, say, Rand would want to do, but rather facts which are out there, as it were, in their own world, if you think about it that way. And that we have, just as we've got physical senses like sight and hearing, we also have a moral sense, so that you can think of an actual or an imagined situation, and you have the reaction, what he did was wrong or what he did was right. And then the claim would be that, although it's not perfectly consistent, but of course factual physical claims aren't perfectly consistent either, that it's pretty consistent. And in particular, that if you think about it not in terms of laws of morality, because after all, people don't necessarily agree about physical laws either. If you think about, say, economic propositions, the question, does raising the minimum wage help or hurt poor people? Well, that's not a morals proposition. That's a physical proposition, but it's a complicated one. On the other hand, if you say, I just saw this man beating up a small kid for the fun of it, what do you think of that? You will get, I think, a pretty uniform reaction to that question. So if you think about the perceptions, not as the moral laws deduced from those perceptions, but just as sort of a basic perception, like seeing a cup or a pen or something on the table, then they seem to come close to the standard that we use for believing physical propositions. So that's the basic intuitionist argument, and there are obviously possible responses to it. The most convincing response, I think, intellectually speaking, is all of this morality is an illusion. We have that. The reason people mostly agree in their moral reactions is either they've been brought up by a culture that teaches them certain moral rules, or maybe evolution has hardwired them with certain moral rules. And that is a defensible proposition. That's an alternative explanation of the same data. But that's an explanation that doesn't answer the question I want answered, because the question I want answered is not why do I feel this way, but what should I do? And the interpretation of consistent moral intuitions, which says we are imperfectly observing actual facts. It really is wrong to do certain wicked things. That's also consistent with the data. And that, unlike the other one, actually answers the question I want answered. I've sometimes put this argument as my version of Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager, as you probably know, was the argument that said, if you don't believe in God, and Christianity is true, you are likely to go to hell. That's very unfortunate. If you do believe in God and Christianity is false, well, you're going to miss some pleasurable sins, but that's a much, much smaller, a tiny cost compared to going to hell. And not only the tiny cost, at least I think he would argue, many Christians would argue, on the whole, the rules of Christian morality are pretty sensible rules for living your life anyway, so therefore following them isn't going to cost you very much. And that was his argument. And there are various responses to make. But my variant of the argument is to say, suppose there are two propositions. One is that moral propositions are true or false, and the other is they're an illusion. Well, if you act on the belief that they're true or false, and try to do morally right things and avoid doing morally wrong things, and it's not really true, if they're really an illusion, well, you might miss a few pleasant sins that you commit. On the other hand, given that you've been brainwashed into or hardwired by evolution with this set of views, you're not going to enjoy those sins very much anyway, because you'll feel guilty about them. So therefore, the cost of making the mistake of believing that moral propositions are true is pretty low if they aren't true. Whereas if they are true, then believing they aren't true insofar as you do things that you perceive as immoral, as wicked, as wrong things, is that you're doing bad things. And in terms of what we mean by normative propositions, that's something you shouldn't do. So that's a variant of it. But I think the fundamental reason that I prefer the intuitionist to the, what's the right term, but the basically
the preference-oriented type.
What?
The type that would be more oriented to seeing things as preferences, whatever that is.
Well, I was thinking of it not even as that. I was thinking of the alternative theory of why their preferences doesn't explain consistency. But the alternative theory is that morality is entirely a fake, but there are reasons why we believe in it.
Yeah.
And the problem is that I can't believe that. That's a psychological statement about me, not a logical statement. That is to say, I'm not in fact capable of believing that doing horrible things to people doesn't matter. So I certainly don't claim that I can demonstrate that my moral views are correct, but I think I've just described what is the basis for them. And Mike Humer is a libertarian philosopher. You may know he actually has a book on intuitionism, and his position is pretty close to mine. And I think the only thing we disagree about that I know of is that he thinks that the alternative theory is clearly wrong. He thinks that he has good arguments against the alternative theory, and I don't. I think that the alternative theory is consistent with the available evidence, but I have reasons why I prefer this one.
Right. So I do know Mike, and actually I have an episode I'm going to release. It's going to be my first episode of this podcast with Mike. He was generous with his time. We spoke mostly about epistemology and not so much about his intuitionism, but it did come up. I think you and I will both agree. Mike is excellent. I'm a big fan of Mike's, and I appreciate it. So his intuitionism is my favorite moral theory. I just sort of like you, I can't, I'm almost in the opposite position of you. I want to believe it, but can't. And the reason I can't is because I'm one of those ones that's interpreting this entire situation, the other in the alternative that you've described. And I really appreciate, I wrote about your, I read about your debate that you thoroughly lost. And also, your thoughts about intuitionism in your latest version of Machinery of Freedom. And I had just enormous sympathy with going back and forth internally about these issues. And so I wonder, so for example, you said like preferences, and correct me if I'm paraphrasing correctly, but preferences on basic moral things are almost ubiquitous. And we would, I do think that's it's explained by just game theory. It would be strange, right, if we all or mostly all wanted to shove pins into each other. It would be hard to understand how we got here. And I think that with physics, and this is why I sort of brought up physics initially, because you are expressing sort of a worry about finding data that doesn't fit into the model or would be contradictory, right? In physics, if we found like, let's say 3% of the time, which I'll approximate to the number of psychopaths in society right now, let's say 3% of the time, general relativity just failed flatly, we would worry about that as our sense.
But on the other hand, if we find that there are people who think they're Napoleon, or there are people who see something that isn't there, that doesn't make us worry about the existence of physical reality.
No.
That similarly, if in my version of moral philosophy, if I went from my moral perceptions to a theory, if I said, here are the correct moral rules, and I then said, I can imagine a situation where that moral rule leads to what is clear to me as the wrong answer. Well, that would be an argument against the moral rule, exactly like your case with the argument against general relativity. So I think you want to distinguish the sort of the base facts of the perception, which I really want to see as moral judgments that one would make about a well-described situation, from the theories that you then build upon that. And I think that the former are the equivalent to seeing things. There are people who are colorblind, after all. That doesn't make you conclude that colors don't exist. There are people who are deaf. That doesn't make you conclude that sounds don't exist.
No, yeah. So I think my worry here, and I'm happy to be set straight. In some sense, it would be a huge relief for me. My worry here is that it's not perfectly analogous to say, because somebody is schizophrenic, we don't think that reality doesn't exist, right? Because the physical reality we think exists, sort of, it would be surprising if nobody was schizophrenic in it, right? It would be really surprising. So that's the part where I really think I can't sort of escape this sort of physicalist type of thinking, right? I can understand how schizophrenia arises from a physical unit, really a physical determinist game theoretic universe. I don't
But
understand
you don't really.
exactly.
That is, you don't have any reason to think it couldn't arise, but nobody really understands how the brain works.
I don't think we completely understand how the brain works, but I think we've got a pretty good grasp on most of what it does. I don't think that, for example, we're going to find, and this is actually very timely, this conversation, because do you know Robert Sapolsky? Have you seen any of his work?
I don't think
I
so. I
thought
don't
you
recognize the name.
He's a biologist, and he's making the sort of rounds right now, or maybe he's a neurologist or both, because he's released a book called Determined, and actually had a debate with Mike Humer
Yeah,
about
this
that.
I've seen a reference to that somewhere. It's determinism versus free will.
Yes, exactly. So, and in the book, he talks about all these biological and physical reasons, specifically about the brain, about why you really don't have any free will, which is not something that I think I necessarily need to litigate for this conversation. But I think what comes out of it, what basically falls out if you accept that you don't control your brain and that it's basically a physical deterministic process, is that a lot of sort of the blame that we assign in society for doing something criminal, for example, really becomes more analogous to a person being a broken car than a blameworthy car. And he still kind of gets
the problem with all of these lines of argument to me is that we do not have any understanding of consciousness.
You don't think so?
I could understand you just fine as a P zombie.
Yes.
I can understand you as a programmed computer. I do not have any idea of why there's actually a person looking out of your eyes. And as far as I know, nobody else does either. And yet the fact of my consciousness, as Descartes pointed out some time ago, is more or less the single thing we are most certain of. All right. All of your perception of the physical reality is ultimately coming through sense information coming in through your mind, through your consciousness.
Yeah. So I had on this topic actually a really good conversation about this with Mike, who I'm sure won't mind being brought up this much. And it turned into a discussion about how he and I both experience our own consciousness, because it was a discussion about epistemology. And I don't actually find that most of what I think or do is something that I am aware of, or even that I will to have happen. Even deliberation, which is
what does this I mean?
It's so what I picture.
What is the I that is or isn't doing these things?
I love the question. Yeah. So I've thought about all this stuff. The I, exactly. So people use this term loosely, and they tend to sometimes mean their body. Sometimes they mean particular aspects of their brain. When I think of I think of whatever part of my brain notices other parts of my brain. And I'm not sure that even that requires consciousness. I worry about this stuff.
Do you think that when parts of your computer software react to other parts of computer software, there's a person there?
No, although I'm not sure that we're that different, honestly, from
well, actually there's a very, it just occurs to me that I've got a very old example of an experiment on the subject of where I am is. It's from one of the Icelandic sagas,
awesome.
The Viking saga, and a group of Vikings have been captured in a battle that they chose not to run away from after their side was lost, and are being executed one by one. And this is a particular group which are famous for their courage. And so the people who have captured them want to see if they're really as brave as they're said to be. And so each person, they said, how do you feel about dying? And get various responses. And one of the people says, well, I don't mind dying, but it occurred to me that this is the perfect opportunity to settle an argument we've been having. Oh, what argument is that? The question is a man in his head or in his body? So what I'd like to do, if it's all right with you, is I'll take this knife, a little knife of mine, and I'll hold it point down. Have somebody cut my head off with a very sharp sword. As soon as my head is off, I will try to turn the knife point up. So if I am in my head, I will no longer control my body after you cut my head off, and the knife will fall point down. If I'm in my body, then I'll be able to turn it and the knife will fall point up, because it takes several seconds for a man to die. So if not too much trouble, would you mind doing the experiment? And they do, and the knife falls point down.
Right.
But in fact, my point is really that people 1,000 years ago, more or less, well, the saga was probably written down more like 800 or 900 years ago, but the events are happening earlier than that. We don't know if the story is true, of course, but we're thinking about the question of where your consciousness is.
Yeah.
And I don't think, I don't know. I don't in fact think, I mean, I think my cat is conscious, but I don't think my computer is.
I love my dog, and sometimes I'm not sure if she's conscious or not.
But my basic point is that it does seem to me that you have to face the fact that the existence, what somebody has described as the ghost in the machine, the existence of a person who's thinking at the moment, is the most fundamental bedrock fact we've got, because everything else filters through that.
So I'm not. Phenomenal conservatism is something that I'm a big fan of, which is sort of my way, and I didn't invent it. Obviously, this is again my humorous construct, but sort of my way of getting out of solipsism, in that I'm willing to accept the way things seem until I have reason to believe otherwise. And it's not because I think this is really a bedrock.
But in that case, you've got to believe in free will.
No, well, it doesn't seem to me like I have it.
You don't seem to observe yourself making choices.
No.
Will I do X or Y?
Right. So I do experience deliberation, but that doesn't seem to me incompatible with a deterministic world, right? It seems like a statement about my limited amount of information in the system. Like
Could you decide whether to raise your right hand or your left hand now?
I could, but am I actually going to be making a conscious decision that I had control over? So, for example, Sam Harris, who I have serious misgivings about in some areas and really enjoy in other areas, has an example where it goes something like, try to think of a city right now.
A what?
Right? And a city like Cairo or Tokyo, or just any example of a city. And then he asks you to try to think of why you thought of that city. And people will often be able to come up with a story. They'll say something like, well, I thought of Glasgow because I had McDonald's last night. I don't know, something like that. But when we look at the neurological data, it really does seem like the left hemisphere is making up a post hoc rationalization as to where this thought came from. And I think a lot of our choices are like that. Like, I think that when you start to notice and really spend time wondering, where did that thought come from? How much control did I have over it?
Then you're rejecting phenomenal conservatism, because you're saying, even though it appeared to me that I made a choice, that I decided what city to think about, I wasn't really, because here this very fancy argument, which depends on lots of machinery and stuff attached to people's brains, somehow can show it isn't true.
I think that might be a fair comment, or it might just be that I'm updating my prior, right? That it might just be that okay, that's how it appeared to me. There might be reasons why it appeared to me that way too, because I grew up in a particular culture, it's big on individualism, choices, freedom of expression.
Except that very nearly everybody, I can't talk about what people were like 10,000 years ago.
That becomes interesting.
We don't have any data on that. I know somebody's got a weird theory about it, but as far as all of the societies that we know about, that we've got written information from, or are still exist and we can talk to people, all of them talk as if there was a consciousness. That lots of them believed in a soul, and they could argue what happened to the soul or what the soul was like, but nonetheless, and the soul really is a way of thinking about that consciousness.
Yeah, and so I think what you're probably were alluding to, and by no means am I representing this as a settled fact, although it's an interesting story that really hasn't been disproven, is the bicameral mind theory from Julian Jaynes.
Correct.
Right?
And I have not read the literature on that. It struck me as a nice, striking thing that was probably not true, and that
It might not
hard
be,
to
yeah.
find evidence for or against.
Yeah, so he engaged. I don't want to get into a big thing about it, especially if you're not convinced by it. It's he engaged in sort of a textual statistical analysis, right, of earliest texts to see how often people describe themselves as thinking or feeling or showed signs of consciousness.
What are his earliest texts?
I think the earliest ones were, I could be wrong about this because it's been some time, but I think the oldest writing he started with was cuneiform, and then he went into a huge analysis of Homer, that era's writings, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Now, human beings
by
have been
Homer,
around.
by Homer, we've got a good deal of stuff.
Yeah.
Most of the cuneiform is not sort of long essays, but is things like laws and recipes.
Yes.
You know, what'll fit on one clay tablet, more or less.
That's right. Yeah. So I'm not sure that I don't agree with phenomenal conservatism so much as I have maybe just updated my initial biases, and I don't mean that in a mean way at all. My personal biases in a number of ways by learning new facts and then going, oh, how does this fit in here? Now, maybe I'm wrong. I would like to be wrong on this issue, I have to tell you. But the more things come out about AI, the more often I see something like a Roomba deliberating about where to go to vacuum a room. I start to wonder, how far off the mark am I from this thing? I hope you're at least entertained by this.
Yeah. It's just that we understand more or less how computers work, and because we can build them, and you can build very, very simple computers. There's something called, I think, a matchbox computer that consists of matchboxes with colored things in them that you arrange to play tic-tac-toe, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And I cannot see that in any sense looking as though there's a conscious being there. It's a mechanical sequence. Now, I agree, it is certainly possible that you're a p-zombie. I've got no way of checking that. And the computer explanation could in principle explain everybody but me. But I've got this firsthand data. Now I'm sitting inside this head, as it were. It feels like that. There's somebody there, and maybe there are illusions. Maybe I'm really sitting inside my chest, or maybe I'm sitting inside a chest somewhere, a box somewhere, or maybe I'm a brain in a vat. But whatever I am, I have this direct perception of my own consciousness.
So,
which will ergo sum.
Yeah. So, what would it be like, I wonder, though, to be a computer that notices another part of itself? And I wonder, would that be any different? And I'm not sure I can answer that. Yeah. I just don't.
Well, I think it is certainly possible that a computer could be conscious. I don't think any existing computers are, as far as I can tell. Yeah. But since I don't understand consciousness, I don't know. It's very hard to make positive statements about what can be. So it might be that somehow when you have a sufficiently elaborate connected set of logical circuits, it becomes conscious. It's I don't know if you know Heinlein's Moon is a Harsh Mistress, but
I do. Yeah.
Mike, in that one, he has some kind of a throwaway line about that Mike woke up at some point might be so. That is to say, there certainly is reason to think that the human brain is something like a big computer. So maybe sufficiently elaborate computers are conscious. Maybe there's an immaterial soul, which God or fate or something puts in your head, and that's what's doing it. I don't know. And I think that people are much too confident of things that they don't really have a way of knowing.
Well, on that, I completely agree. And I am not on. I would not describe myself anywhere near 100% confident that morals don't exist. Mm-hmm. I do have, I think, some legitimate worries about it. One thing that's nice, I think, about sort of some of the things that I think both you and I care about, namely, we're both anarcho-capitalists is that it's often easy to, when debating with somebody or explaining to somebody the merits of it, avoid this issue entirely, right? I mean, you can just ask somebody, like, would you like to live in a society that's more or less prosperous? And almost every time they're going to say more prosperous, and you can work from there. I don't worry about it so much when I'm talking about anarcho-capitalism, but when I start reading about somebody like John Rawls, and most of Rawls, I can safely ignore. Some of it when he starts going, well, do you really deserve what you have?
Yeah, yes, that's a not really a question of where does morality come from, but there is an argument there, but I think the argument is wrong, because not only do I not deserve to be well educated and intelligent and maybe honest, various other things, because all of those things in some sense are products of previous cause. I also don't deserve to be a human being instead of a cat, or a cat instead of a rock. That
Right.
is, it seems to me that the problem with that, I mean, I've probably written about it somewhere, but the problem with that line of argument is that once you abstract away from somebody all the features of that person which he did not himself cause, you are left with nothing. There's nothing left. Nothing on a different way of putting it is, if you really take that argument seriously, well, there's no reason why I should be rich. There's no reason why I shouldn't be. Nobody has any claim to anything. So therefore, in particular, if I get rich by stealing money from people, well, they don't have any claim to that money either. I mean, a rock doesn't have a claim to money. So once you take the position all the way, I think you lose all possibility of moral judgment. And the way I would put it is that when we make a moral judgment of somebody, we aren't making a moral judgment of the disembodied imaginary consciousness before he was born. We're making a moral judgment of that person as he now exists. And if that person as he now exists is nasty and dishonest, well, nasty and dishonest people one ought to think poorly of, whether or not the reason they are nasty and dishonest is that they were brought up by parents who did a bad job of teaching them, or that they happen to have genes for psychopathy or something of that sort. So I guess my answer to that line of argument would be that what I'm judging is not the abstracted being minus all features that he didn't himself cause. What I'm judging is the being as he now is, including all features, whether he caused them or not.
Yeah. So, and I find I can get out of this in my own head in a similar move that I explained about anarcho-capitalism, which is just that, like, okay, maybe I don't deserve to have the benefits or reap the fruits of my work because I didn't choose to have the talents and the drive I have and whatever. But what do I do then? I mean, what's the other alternative? Giving it to somebody who's going to waste resources? Or it's not clear to me that there's a good alternative, so I don't worry about it too much in the practical sense, right? But I find that a lot of libertarian conversation doesn't go that way, David. if I can use that term as a euphemism, I find a lot of it is really focused on delivering resources where they morally belong, and less of it is focused on delivering resources where it just makes the most sense to put them. And I'm convinced more by arguments about where it just makes the most sense to put the resources versus where it makes most moral sense.
So how do you feel about utilitarian arguments that are inconsistent with our moral perceptions? So my standard example, which I have in Machinery somewhere, is you're the police officer of a town. There have been several very ugly murders. The citizens are up in arms. There are a couple of suspects, and you think it's quite likely that 2 or 3 of them will get lynched. You don't know who's guilty, but you have enough evidence to frame one of the suspects. In fact, one of the suspects who you're pretty sure is not in fact guilty. But you frame him and convict him and hang him. That means only one guy dies instead of three. Should you do it? Looks like a utilitarian win, and yet my moral intuition is no.
Yeah, I don't like it. Like I would not want to do that to somebody.
But that's because your moral intuition says people who have not committed murders have a right not to be hanged. Not that it is
I don't disagree.
Allocating resources.
Yeah, so I don't disagree. My moral intuition is that I would not want to do that to somebody, especially, I mean, for very obvious reasons that anybody would be able to imagine, even if they didn't agree. I mean, you might empathize with the person. You might wonder, am I going to be that person one day? You might not want to live in a society that looks like that.
You can empathize with the people who will get lynched too.
Yeah,
they're the ones you're saving.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I'm not saying that defends it. I think it's easy to imagine why somebody would have the intuition, I guess is what I'm saying. But then there's going to be somebody else, like a good example. Well, first of all, I have seen plenty of libertarians who I would not describe as utilitarians give out at some point. Like I think this might even be one of your examples, although it's not perfectly analogous, and I'm not trying to saddle you with utilitarianism. Like, would you how does it go? Scratch someone else's finger, or would you use your finger to scratch somebody else's arm to prevent a meteorite from destroying humanity? At some point, the scale is going to tip in the intuition of somebody.
But this is a question, I think, not of what moral beliefs are, but of what your moral beliefs are. And as it happens, my moral beliefs are not bright edge libertarianism. That is to say, I think the more you think about it, the clearer it becomes that you can't make a simple statement such as nobody should ever initiate coercion, because you can think of too many cases where you would disagree with that statement. And therefore, all of those statements are sort of rules of thumb, first approximations. And I can say, well, scratching somebody's arm is a bad thing to do. It's even a bad thing to do if it benefits him, if you don't have his permission. If scratching his arm would help him a little bit, but he doesn't believe you when you tell him that, you shouldn't scratch his arm. But if scratching his arm will prevent all life on Earth being wiped out by an asteroid strike, go ahead and do it. So I would have, in sort of my perception of moral, of not where it comes from, but what my moral beliefs are, is that respecting people's rights, the standard sort of libertarian view, has some weight, but it doesn't have infinite weight. And that there are other things which, I guess utility would be one of them, but they're probably more general than that, that also have some weight. And therefore, if you get a very big benefit in one thing at a small cost in another, you probably do it.
Yeah, like, so I can think of, so there's somebody else who I have a lot of respect for, libertarian for sure, is Chris Friedman. I don't know if you're familiar with his work at all, but he's a political philosopher, I think would be the best term. And he is a utilitarian, and he and I will agree on almost every, you probably would too, on almost every social policy, every economic policy with him. But he happens to think utilitarianism shakes out in favor of libertarianism. And so, and he's really consistent with it. He can defend that. And I think he would probably argue about that sheriff example and say, well, I think in a utilitarian perspective, this might not work out the way that, like, we're going to argue about how this would actually work out. How many utils are going in one direction, right?
But I'm going to avoid all of those arguments saying, suppose since it's a hypothetical, I get to rig the game. So I'm going to set it up in such a way that you are quite sure that the various prudential reasons why framing somebody might lower total utility don't happen to apply in this case. Now, do you still do it?
Right. Yeah, you could keep closing in those walls on the utilitarian and trying to squeeze out it. But to me, like a way to avoid this whole thing is to just, again, sort of admit, Well, this is a matter of preference, and most of us are going to share the same preferences. And so if you can give me a conditional about what it is you're looking to do, I can then tell you whether you should or should not do something. But until I have that conditional, I can't tell you really that it's wrong. I can just tell you what my preference is. And I sort of feel like that resolves the tension here too.
But that depends on believing that moral things are only preferences.
Yeah.
And the question is, why is it that your preference for A not murdering B is so much higher than your preference for most other things, given that, A thinks murdering B is just fine, and it'll be killing his rich uncle will get him a nice inheritance, and he can use that money in all sorts of ways. And yet you are probably willing, if you absolutely have to kill A in order to stop him from killing B.
Yeah.
And that seems to me suggests that what you really believe is not preferences. What you really believe is that murdering people is wrong, and therefore it is a good thing to stop them from doing it.
Well, like, again, to use the example, I think this is the one you brought up with your debate that you said you lost, that a moral is like saying I like chocolate ice cream over vanilla, or if whatever it was, jazz or whatever. It just seems explicable to me from the laws of nature directly that we will have preferences as self-replicating things. I just can't see how it would be avoided. So it's like, as long as, I guess, in my head, those preferences are nested inside the physical laws of the universe, there's an explanation for them. And I don't feel like I have to resort to, I don't feel like I'm at the bottom of the explanatory chain where everybody arrives eventually and has to go, I'm going to have to just accept something here to move on thinking. Do you know what I mean? Does that make any sense to you?
I don't think it does, but I'm probably not following you.
Okay. Well, can I try one really quickly?
Yeah.
At some point, you can ask a series of why questions where eventually, no matter how informed somebody is, they're not going to have an explanation as to why.
Right.
And they're going to have to grasp for something to base all of the rest of what they think of. Yes. So, for example, it could be phenomenal conservatism, right? Which is why I like it. It gives me something to hold on to when I'm in the despair of.
But why do you believe in phenomenal conservatism?
The only reason I do, and again, it's like a probabilistic belief, is that I don't see what my opposite choice is. So, like, would my opposite choice to be in total disbelief of things that I see? It doesn't seem like. What do I do with that?
Why don't you choose that? Well, my point is only I keep asking why forever.
Because I don't know how to choose it. I think that's why I don't choose it. I have no idea what that would even look like. You know what I mean? Maybe I'm just deeply confusing the matter.
Yes.
But I think correct me if I'm wrong. I know Mike Humer wrote that book, Ethical Intuitionism. You expressed some kind of worry earlier that this could be due to evolution, these intuitions.
Or to social brainwashing, or to it could be biological evolution, it could be social evolution. You could say, well, societies that don't teach people these things get replaced by ones that do. That's a different version of the same argument.
And you mentioned earlier that maybe you're just not as, you might be convinced in one direction, but not as confident that it's 100% true. So I'm wondering.
I don't think I have an argument. I don't think I have an argument by which I could show somebody who holds the opposite opinion that he's wrong. And I think Mike thinks he does, though I could have misunderstood our exchanges. Right.
Well, I was wondering if you were going to put a confidence level on your intuitionism, and this is totally a loaded question that you can refuse to. What do you feel like? You've obviously wrestled with this at some point, even if it was long ago and that sort of thing. What's your confidence level on this?
I think I have to say higher than 50%.
Yeah. So it's good enough to win a civil case.
Yeah.
Maybe not a criminal one. Not good.
but I don't think that I can prove it to anybody.
Right. And I guess that stems out of the fact that the only thing you're sure of is your thoughts, your self-existence.
Uh-huh. No, I was thinking about this whole thing of consciousness, I think in one of my Substack posts, because there I was thinking about the question of mortality, which I'm really against. And it seemed to me that I was sort of listing what ways I might be still around in 100 or 200 years or something. And one of the ways is maybe I'm wrong in my sort of atheist view that the soul doesn't exist. And the reason that might be the case is because my modern science view doesn't explain the consciousness, and just the standard various versions of religious views do explain is too strong, but they make some sense of consciousness. And therefore I have to consider the possibility that that I'm wrong about that, and that might be very nice as long as it's not one of the versions where I go to hell for the rest of eternity.
Yeah. But there surely must be some part of you when you're thinking that way, it just has God of the gaps screaming in your ear, right? There's going to be a portion of you that. So I would also like to believe that.
Well, I would say that any particular religion is not a very likely answer to these questions, but that some religion is right, or that something like a religion, maybe a religion you haven't discovered is right, is one of the competitors. Now, I should say my younger son, who has historical interests, and who is an actual agnostic. That is, I'm an atheist. I recognize that it might be the case that religion is right, but I don't really assign it a sizable probability. Whereas Bill, as far as I can tell, really is sort of, might well be right, might well be wrong. But his claim is that the best evidence for religion is the history of Joan of Arc, because it turns out that in that case, we've got primary sources. We've got very detailed primary sources, very unusual thing for something that early, but she had one trial by the English and then a rehabilitation trial later by the French. The records of those have survived. That's testimony from people who were witnesses of the stuff, and at least by Bill's account, are just very hard to make a non-supernatural explanation of what they say.
Now, I have to go read that later. That sounds amazing.
Yes, well, he wants to learn French so that he can read the stuff in the original, but he's going on translation now. But yeah, there are apparently, I don't know, when we have Slate Star Codex meetups, he sometimes lectures people on whatever is his current historical topic, and one of the ones has been that one in the past.
That's super interesting, and it gives me something to look forward to, learning something about which I know nothing. So
yes.
That's one of my favorite things in life. Can I steal 5 more minutes of your time?
Sure.
To sort of go down a little separate road, although it's not a very big diversion, or at least it's closely related to what we've been talking about. I mean, a lot of times when people tell me, they give me the I think that therefore I am, that type of person is also often convinced of sort of Platonic ideas of bedrock belief. So for example, they'll think oneness, the number 1, is not just like a physical counting number our brains have just derived from seeing one of something. Or they'll think 1 + 1 entails 2, and that would be true whether the whole physical universe was gone or not. There's not a straight line from I think therefore I am to.
I would think that 1 + 1 is 2.
Yeah,
does not depend on physical reality, whether it is useful for making sense of physical reality. That if you could say, after all, that in the case of reproduction, 1 + 1 = 3, because you have a man, a woman, and a child as a result and that depends what plus is. And you could certainly imagine a physical world where everything was very fluid, and you say, well, here's one and here's one. Let's put 1 + 1. Bigger
one. Yeah.
Bigger glove.
I understand. Yeah.
But it seems to me that conceptually 1 + 1 equals 2 is true. It's just there may not be anything in the physical reality that is useful for making sense of.
Yeah. So that makes sense to me too. That like whether there was anything here or not, 1 + 1 still might make 2. If there was something around to notice it, that's sort of a bonus.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that it doesn't become true once that noticing thing is gone. But I struggle sometimes with how do I categorize that insofar as well, let me give you an example from something I saw. I'm sorry, I'm being a little scattershot here. Let me give you an example from something that I saw in a debate a long time ago between yourself and Robert Murphy from the Mises Institute, where it was about Austrian economics. And a real sticking point was he was arguing about sort of necessarily true logic being the basis of Austrian economics. And you were pointing out that, well, sometimes you have to go out into the universe and test it, right? I mean, to know whether it's true. And I'm more of a sometimes you got to go out into the universe and test it to know that it's true type of person. But I worry sometimes when I start thinking about things that necessarily must be true, like my own thoughts or 1 + 1 = 2. What is that category of things? Like what?
But I guess my view on the Austrian is that the reason you have to test it is, first, you may have made mistakes in your argument. You may have made some assumptions without realizing you're making them. Second, that you may have made logical errors in your argument, which is pretty easy to do. And let me give you an example. Jim Buchanan, who was a colleague of mine a very long time ago, I remember once saying that increasing the minimum wage increases unemployment among minimum wage level workers. And that statement, and all economists agree with that statement. And that is not a empirical observation. It's part of the definition of economist. He was wrong.
Right.
In fact, you can set up a set of facts entirely consistent with ordinary economics in which raising the minimum wage increases employment for those people. Now, it requires that the employers be monopsonists. That as monopsonists, they are holding down employment in order to hold down wages. And I first discovered that in a prominent article often cited in support of minimum wage. But in fact, as I later discovered, George Stigler made that point like in 1945 or something, and something written a very long time ago as one possible logical. So Jim had made a mistake.
Right.
I'm pretty sure he'd made a mistake. I think I could if he were still around, I could demonstrate to him, could point out to him that his claim actually is that all economists agree that in a competitive labor market, this is true. And even that would be a slight exaggeration. I can think of less plausible circumstances in which you could imagine not being true. But it seems to me that my objection to the Austrian is not that a priori statements necessarily, that nothing can be known a priori. It's that getting from a priori statements to the real world involves assumptions about the real world, involves the possibility of logical mistakes in your a priori reasoning. I mean, Mises makes a logical mistake in his a priori reasoning because Mises claims that the subjective discount rate can't be negative. All right, that it cannot be possible that people value a future utile more than a present utile, so to speak. And that's just a mistake, because his argument is that if people did that, they would transfer all consumption to the infinite future, basically.
Right.
But of course, that's wrong. He's forgetting declining marginal utility. And therefore, as you transfer even if I prefer one utile next year to one utile this year, once I've transferred some of my consumption to next year, now $1 will get me 2 utiles now, and that's worth more than 1 utile next year. So as far as I can tell, and that, I was a little surprised. I expected Rothbard to do things like that, but I was surprised that Mises did, and maybe he explains it further somewhere, but I think he just made a mistake.
Yeah, it's, well, sure. I mean, and everybody does. So I guess it's fair to say then that it's not so much that you think everything in the world needs to be tested against reality, so much as the more farther you get from the base idea that, well, I know I'm thinking right now, the more you're going to have to test to make sure that you're sticking with something that's true. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I suppose, but in general, I don't really believe much in certainty.
No, me neither.
One of the places I would disagree with Ayn Rand
Yeah.
is in the idea that knowledge gets you certainty, whereas normally knowledge gets you reasonable belief.
Right. See, and that's interesting, because I think that the usual person that would say like 1 + 1 = 2 in the mathematical sense, let's forget about combining bundles of laundry and that sort of thing, is true whether there's people here or not, would think that is absolutely true. Right?
Might be missing something.
Yeah, I agree. Well, you know what? I think that's a perfect sentiment to end this podcast on.
Yes.
And
Thank you. It was fun.
I'm glad. That's my primary goal.
Point people at my webpage. That's
absolutely. You tell me, where can people find you?
DavidDFriedman.com.
I will definitely include a link.
And I have a Substack, but there's a link to the Substack on the webpage. And I have a blog that I'm not writing for anymore because I'm writing for the Substack instead, but it's still all up there. And so people can search the past things of my blog if they feel like it. All right.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I hope to have you on another time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.